Hey there, welcome back to the After the Sermon podcast, this place where we talk about the text that we studied out on Sunday morning and just give some reminders, maybe a little more insight or some information that we just couldn't dive into deeply Sunday, and just some reminders of just the application of the text to our lives. I am Pastor Ben, here with Pastor Matt.
Hey guys.
And if I had enough heads up, I would have gotten my Elvis wig repaired and more of that on Sunday, but it may have been distracting.
Yeah, that would have been, I don't know what I would have done with that. Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's foam and one of the corners broke off, so it's...
Oh, man. Yeah, can you do the leg shimmy like Elvis?
Not on camera. He couldn't either.
Yeah.
But so on Sunday, as we're moving through the Bible, the story of grace, we have moved our way out of the time of the judges, transitioning into the period of the kingdom of Israel. Yeah. Starting with 1 Samuel, as we kind of jumped through quite a few chapters, again, not being able to go through every single detail, but seeing the calling of Samuel as the last judge and as a prophet, and then the ascension of Saul as the first king, and then really who we're going to focus on for several weeks now, the calling of David as king.
Yeah, someone mentioned in my life group this past week, as we were talking about Ruth, just these are stories that are very familiar if you've grown up in church. But to see them in this light, they had said, I've never have seen how the dots are connected. And it really is cool of how they're all just pointing to Jesus. But there may not be a character in the entire Old Testament that points to Jesus like David. And this is a completely different shift this is a scene change. This is intermission has happened at a play. I'll use language that you're familiar with. They've closed the curtains. There's intermission. They are redoing the entire set here. And we move from the patriarchs with Abraham and Noah and Jacob, Genesis, to Moses and the judges. We are now in the kingdom time period, which is going to take the rest of the Old Testament. It's going to be a layer. Even when the prophets show up, they're dealing with kings. And you would think that this is an exciting thing taking place, but it's actually somewhat of the downfall for the nation of Israel. That they have prosperity. They have great prosperity with David and Solomon. After that, it's a hot mess of division and fighting and infighting and exiles. And they're still wanting, even when you get to the New Testament, a king to show up and rule them, one like David. And that's why he's the George Washington, so to speak, for the Jewish people. And so when we look at the call of David, we look at this, yes, David is a great man. He's very flawed, but David, in his role as king, is always pointing to a greater king and a greater kingdom.
Yeah, and David gets this moniker that I'm sure will come up several times over the next few weeks, that he was a man after God's own heart.
Yeah.
Even I know there's a book, devotional series based on that, being able to look at, again, not putting David on a pedestal where he is this perfect example, but that's quite an honorific for somebody, even despite some of the problems, which we'll look at those too over the next few weeks.
Yep.
But so how did we get from judge to king?
So after the book of Judges closes, you see they're still continuing to do evil. Then you get what feels like a separate story. We've moved on out of the Judges, but we're introduced to Hannah, who is not able to have children, and it's breaking her heart. She pleads with the Lord. Which is my favorite part, that she's at church, so to speak, pleading with the Lord to have children. And Eli's, are you drunk? So that's how desperate her plea is. And the Lord gives her Samuel. She then gives back to the Lord. And just so you've given me this child, I'm giving him back to you. And
as a Nazirite, I believe, right?
I can't remember off the top of my head.
Yeah, I think that's the connection.
to Samson.
Mm-hmm.
And so while you're looking that up, while Samuel is being raised in the home of Eli, God calls him and calls him as prophet. And we see later on in chapter 7, I believe it is, where Samuel judged over Israel. And so he acts as a prophet, like God would speak to him, and then he would speak to the people of Israel. Very similar to Isaiah and even Moses. And so God speaks to him, he would speak, but then he also functioned as a judge where he would go and deliver the people. Samuel is an incredible figure. And he sets up his sons over as judges, which they're the worst. And from that, the people say, we're done with this. We want a king like all the other kings. And Samuel takes it to God, and God said, they're not going to want this. They've basically, God tells them, you want an earthly king when I've been your king this whole time. And he allows them to have what they want, which leads to King Saul, and which leads to prosperity, but it also leads to a whole lot of problems. And God is going to remind them, even in this calling of, we want a king, he says, okay, but I'm going to establish a greater kingdom that will live for all of eternity. Basically telling your kingdom won't live. It won't last for all of eternity, but mine will. And that's how we get, too long, didn't read it, version of how we get from Judges to the Kings is Samuel's kind of the in-between for him. And he works with Saul and he works with David. And he's that transitional piece that God uses.
Yeah, and Samuel's involvement here is also impressive because he is not that he has a perfect life. We know his sons have moral failures, but he does what God tells him to do. And the text continually says, he repeated the words of God to the people.
Over and over again.
Over and over. And then even with Saul, when Saul finally gets called out and then David is picked, he is the least likely of the candidate of the family. And yet Samuel points out God knows the king that we need. He doesn't look at the outside like man does, but he's able to look at the heart.
Yeah. David and Saul are very two different types of people. It's tall. Saul is much taller than everybody else. I think David was very average looking. I think because Jesus was average looking. He was a shepherd. He had the least job. No one would look at him, right? There's all sorts of comparisons that the world looks at, charisma and competency, capacity in Saul and stature, but they never concerned themselves with character. And that's what God was after. And so you see David coming, and Samuel's afraid. We talked about this a little bit. Samuel's afraid to make this change. He knows Saul is not on the Lord's side anymore. He rebels. There's a great where the language of the text literally says there's this king that Saul was supposed to kill in 1 Samuel chapter 15. Bring me Agag, the king of the Amalekites. And Agag came to him cheerfully. And then it says in verse 33, and Samuel hacked Agag to pieces before the Lord in Gilgal. So not only is Samuel a prophet and a judge, he's an incredible with the sword. Hacked him to pieces, willing to do what Saul's not willing to do, which leads to David. But yet Samuel's hesitant, and God tells him, no, I'll tell you, and he'll be the right king. And Samuel believes him. And that's how we get to David. A very unlikely story because Samuel just assumes it's the oldest, but it's not. It's always the one you least expect.
It's also interesting, again, because we can't talk about everything, but David's called to serve Saul, to play a harp to help with a spirit that is bothering him. He goes to Saul to figure out what to do with Goliath, offered the armor, and so there's a connection between David and Saul. And then, again, I know as we look at David's life, we'll see some of this. Jonathan, who is Saul's son, is David's best friend. I mean, there is, I would imagine as Samuel, that's going to be hard too, of knowing, hey, this guy who's inside your inner circle is going to take over your kingdom.
And he says, after they return from defeating Goliath, everybody's singing David's praises, and it makes Saul mad. And he says in chapter 18, and what more can he have but the kingdom? And this is, I think, an indictment of ours, of our own lives. We want our own kingdom. We don't want anybody to take it. We want to rule. We want to, and it's something as Christians we fight against. And that was the whole point of the sermon: is we need a better king. We don't need a worldly king. We need a king from God, and we need King Jesus, who's better than King Saul. Saul was after money and popularity and fame and pride. Those kings are not worth reigning in our hearts. And so we need to put those kings to death and submit to the eternal reign of King Jesus.
Yeah, and we said this way back when we first started this study of we're not the main character of the Bible, but that Jesus is. And it's the same in our lives too, and that's hard. A little hard sometimes to swallow of what do you mean I'm not in control? I'm not in control of my destiny, that kind of language that the world says. But I think for the Christian, the reminder of, man, if we were in control, just think about the actual chaos that our lives would be. It would be the kingship of Saul.
Yeah, it would be all. If we were, and you see it, God in Romans 1, God hands them over to their, basically, oh, you want to be king? Okay. What grace that he intervenes.
So what can we look forward to as we're looking into not just the life of David as king? Again, obviously he is a great type of Jesus, which is great, but just setting up the second act here in the Old Testament.
Yeah, so obviously we're going to get to some really cool stories with David and Goliath coming up this coming week. And we have David and Bathsheba, which is not a cool story, and how the Lord uses that. Then we'll talk about David, a story that we don't often talk about, but I love this story. And it's one I really wanted to include, David and Mephibosheth. And it's just an incredible picture of grace there. And then from there, we move to Solomon, David's son, and we look at how God deals with other kings and prophets proclaiming a greater kingdom is coming. And then when we even move out of that, how we'll look at Esther here in a little while, and there's another kingdom at play, Daniel, another kingdom at play, but God's king over there and sovereign over there. And then when we even see how God uses earthly kings to repair what's ruined, Nehemiah and Ezra. But what's really cool is this: we are obviously still in the first half of the Old Testament, but we are transitioning right now already to the New. And so we look at the transition to the New Testament with Malachi and the prophets, but it's happening now. And we will cover less time period between now. We'll cover more books, but a less time period than we did with Genesis. We covered a lot of years then. But then you move right into the book of Matthew, which is all about the kingdom of Jesus. And what we talk about in the New Testament, it's the kingdom motif is really going to be driving our conversations. And because one day every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord of Lords and King of Kings. And ultimately, this is what God's accomplishing or moving to, even his eternal reign. It's so much that takes place that God takes a unnecessary desire from his people to want an earthly king, and he turns it into an eternal one. It was part of the plan, and a pretty good one. And it leads us to ask the question, like I ended Sunday's sermon, type of king are we looking for? And it better be King Jesus.
Yeah, it's always, sometimes I think we look at Old Testament history and the things that the Israelites go through and think, gosh, they were so dumb. Why would they do these things? And sometimes we take it the one step further to say, okay, I can relate to them. I do the same thing in my life. But I think, too, we need the examples of imperfect kings to realize the perfection of Jesus.
Yeah.
Yep. And that's where, again, even as we look at David's life, he's not a perfect king. We can't follow every type of thing that he does, but we can follow the type of person that he is because of who he was looking to.
Yep.
So as we get into these books and you're going through following the study, you're going to feel maybe a little bit of repetition to a sense. You got the Kings and the Chronicles sort of telling the same story from slightly different perspectives. But then even as we look at the prophets, you're hearing the same stories, but from a different perspective.
Yep.
It can get a little confusing, but if you follow along with the reading plan, that'll help you. And then there's all kinds of resources, maybe in your study Bible or online, that can help you with timelines as far as trying to figure out, oh, okay, this is what was happening during this king's reign.
Yep.
And we'll do our best to help guide you along that as well.
Yep.
But we will look forward to seeing you in life groups, just a couple more weeks of that before we take a break for summer. And as always, we'll talk through this text and just continue to help point each other to the true king that we need. But whether we see you in life groups or see you on Sunday morning, just know that the only king that you really, truly need is King Jesus. God bless.